Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Yes, hello again and welcome to episode 97 of Just Imagine and the next in our occasional series looking at the various pantomime titles. This time we turn our attention to Sleeping Beauty.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
In the last episode, we reviewed the 2024-25 Panto season with Imagine's joint CEOs Sarah and Steve Bowden. Don't worry though if you missed that or any of the other previous episodes because they are all still available. And so far we've talked with celebrities, backstage team members, practitioners and academics about how pantomime is produced, its history and its future. So make sure you check them out where you normally get your podcasts from, and don't forget to subscribe to the series so that you don't miss any future episodes. Now this time, in this episode, we have the latest in our occasional series looking at the popular pantomime titles, and I've been joined by director and academic Dr. Robert Marsden.
Hi Martin, good to be back.
And actress and director Mairi Bryan. How are you, Mairi?
I'm good, thank you. Yes, or people might know me as Mairi Cowieson as the stage name.
Well, we're going to talk about Sleeping Beauty this time, and it's an interesting one in terms of the story. Of course, we know so many of these come from the Grimm brothers, Rob, and of course they didn't write them, they collated them really because they were all fairy folk tales, weren't they? But Sleeping Beauty has a particularly long history, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. A little bit like Beauty and the Beast, we can trace this story right back to across the world in different cultures, on different continents. You know, we can trace it back to Egypt. In BCE, where you've got the prince who wants to rescue someone from a tower. We've got a kind of a 1300s version as well, which is an anonymous, massive mythical history of England called the Perseforest, and you've got a princess in there, Princess Zelandine, who has a party, and you've got the three goddesses. These themes arrive around, but the third goddess sentences this princess to death, and that's in the 1300s, around about 1330. So we can trace that story right back in culture, in folklore, but also through some of these key points as well, through the 1300s. And then obviously we've got Charles Perrault and Grimm along the way.
And Mairi, of course, it changes a little bit over time. The nucleus, the core of the story is still there. And it opens up with the birth of a princess, doesn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, this fairy tale, as you've said, has been adapted countless times throughout history and retold by modern storytellers across various media. And it's important that we do draw parallels and bring the new beliefs and bring it up to date with the current audience members and add new extra ways of retelling this story in current days. And yes, you've got the birth of Princess Rose or Princess Aurora. She comes by numerous different names throughout time, but all of these stories all basically follow her life and what's happening around her.
And then the enchantment happens, you know, the sleep for 100 years scenario. That's a key part of this. This is something that is unique to this particular panto. The way the enchantment happens and the baddies introduced, Mairi, is different to many others, isn't it?
Yes, well, with this one, we had Caraboss, which she has been known by in various other different stories throughout the years. But with this one, she's actually the Queen's sister, which in other ones she comes by, including the Disney Maleficent, she is known to the king. And in other ones, she's the king's sister. But with this one, it was that she was the Queen's sister, in actual fact, who did help with having the daughter, Aurora, which is in Marsden 21st century remaking of the ballet. And he talks about that part of the story. But yeah, she comes in and bestows this evil spell on Sleeping Beauty to fall asleep, but is stopped by our good fairy, the good fairy of Fife in R1, as the case was, to only fall asleep and not to actually become worse off.
In the story and in pantomime traditionally, Rob, it's probably the only one where the protagonist basically spends the whole show asleep.
Yeah, and that's a difficult one, I think, for modern writers as well. And Mairi was talking about there about how we have to retell these stories. Yeah, most of Act 2, she's asleep. I mean, in the Disney version, I think she has 18 lines, and that's another part of the one of the challenges of this story, the empowerment of the female protagonists. It's really key. But yeah, just spend a lot of time asleep. And going back to what you were saying earlier, I found it fascinating that in the Charles Perrault version, in the kind of 1690s, we don't have this notion of the 100 years in that story. It's just a time where she will. There's no year. Sorry, in terms of going up to the 18th birthday or the 15th birthday. So the time is slightly different in that element as well. The kiss isn't really introduced until the Brothers Grimm version, and then often people are then hanging everything off that in relation to the 100 years. But yeah, she's asleep for so long and part of the story, and different writers are looking at how you might do that, how you might bring her back earlier to be part of the adventure, and so on.
How do you deal with that as a director, though, Rob? Because obviously it's a key part of the story, and when you last directed it, how did you deal with that?
I think in terms of the Act 2, because often at the end of Act 1, we've gone into the falling asleep, and that's a major moment in the piece. I think it's keeping the quest alive, the quest to find Sleeping Beauty. If you are going to keep your titular character asleep for all of that time, you've got to hang everything that happens in Act 2 off something. So often in Act 2, you might have some of the more comedic elements or more front cloth scenes, but that quest and that adventure has to be underlying and bubbling away. We should never lose sight of that story.
Many pantomimes are changing in recent years in terms of the love element, and we're seeing perhaps less of that and more towards the adventure, Mairi. And there is definitely an adventure or a quest, as Rob described it here, and there's that jeopardy as well, isn't there? How did you deal with all of the things we've spoken about in the last season?
Well, absolutely. With our adaptation, we were sympathetic with these views of the modern audience, and whereby the fairy cast the spell, obviously, as we explained with the Sleeping Beauty, she's going to fall asleep. The good fairy, actually, in how we got around that was, it was very cleverly written by Fraser Boyle that the good spirit cast a spell on her to bring her spirit out of her sleeping body for an hour to go on this quest and actually save herself. So that was a really great twist to the story, and a way that we were able to keep our action going, keep our main character involved in the pantomime. And so the beginning of Act 2 was indeed the fairy Bunty, Good Fairy of Fife, bringing Sleeping Beauty's spirit from her sleeping body to rescue the prince who'd been captured by Caraboss. And so she led the search party, and then we had all of those elements that Rob mentioned, all the silly bits and slapstick and the front cloth stuff in front of the front cloth there as well, in amongst her leading this quest to bring back the prince, so that then the prince could indeed wake her up, but with the good fairy of Fife asking for her consent before sending her back to her sleeping body, asking for the consent of the prince to kiss her, which she agrees to. So I think it was nicely tied up, and the audience really appreciated that, and the reviews back on it were that they appreciated the more modern twist to it.
Now, Mairi, we've spoken on these podcasts many, many times about the pantomime elements and the fact that you don't have to have all of the elements in every panto, but as long as you've got most or many of the elements there, it's going to be a success. The difference between Sleeping Beauty and so many others is that there's one element that is missing slightly, and that is the spectacle, the transformation, call it what you will. There is no giant, there's no Cinderella coach and horses flying off, going to the ball. How does that compare then? Do you think it's less of a panto without that spectacular transformation and so on?
No, I don't think so, because you've still got the magic of the fact that the kids are hanging off the fact that they want Sleeping Beauty to wake up. So the beauty of that section, when the prince comes back and they're going in and giving her a kiss and waking her up, and everybody in the kingdom waking up and everything, I think still has such a romantic feel that you feel that you've traveled on this magical journey. But we did, in fact, have a bit of a spectacle because we had our dragon. So the Caraboss's pet dragon, which is also portrayed in the Maleficent and the Disney production, and earlier in some of the earlier stories, with regards to Caraboss either becoming a dragon or having a dragon. So the prince had to fight the dragon in order to get back to the castle in time to wake the princess up. So the dragon was pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I was leaning towards that, Rob, because not every panto has one, but that can be a really spectacular sequence. Now, the panto itself rather than the story, has a rich history of its own because Sleeping Beauty was one of the very first at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane in the 1800s. And it's interesting you mentioned the similarity to Beauty and the Beast because it was actually staged there almost 100 years later as a combination of the two. How does it compare, do you think, Sleeping Beauty? Because Beauty and the Beast is a rising star in the panto canon, isn't it? How does Sleeping Beauty compare to that and others?
Yeah, there are those threads, and again, going back to those folk and fairy tales, there are those threads. There's the otherness in the Beast storyline, but there's otherness that's explored in the Sleeping Beauty storyline in relation to the immortals or the fairy characters, or however you want to call them. And I think Susan McKenna explored this in Catford recently around this kind of idea of banishment, who's banished, and how do you receive them back again. But yeah, going right back to Drury Lane, it was one of Grimaldi's also final performances at Covent Garden. He was getting physically ill at the time in the early 1820s. So it's traced right back. And again, because these stories are just part of our consciousness subconsciously through that folk and fairy tale tradition, you can absolutely see that parallel. And it has grown in popularity. It's been in and out of popularity, like with many titles over the years, but it's been growing again recently.
Yeah, and in 1900, that combination of that and Beauty and the Beast featured twice as many scenes, apparently, a range of locations. Settings included the haunted vaults of the palace, a fairy parliament, and the enchanted crystal garden. And the grand finale was a transformation scene by set designer Bruce Sensation Smith, as he was known, which represented Beauty's wedding gifts as well as a grand staircase and numerous fountains. Productions then, Rob, were so lavish, weren't they?
I know. We've got evidence. We've got all the data from Augustus Harris in relation to hundreds and hundreds of actors being rehearsed overnight, huge scenes, huge transformation scenes, a huge spectacle. And we've always played with that spectacle, haven't we? We've talked on these podcasts in the past around now it's the advent of the digital and the hybrid world of the live and the digital. We've always been pushing the boundaries. A lot of the technologies in theatre came out of pantomime in many ways. And going back to what Mairi was saying around spectacle, there are so many opportunities for that in Sleeping Beauty. I've done the dragon as well. I think it's a great sequence. But you can also really explore with time travel. You can also really explore with all that notion of birthdays or celebrations and those events. And yeah, the arrival of Caraboss can be a major moment as well. Using our imaginations as writers and directors can really embrace that technology that threads all the way through the history of pantomime, particularly at Drury Lane and Covent Garden.
Any particular demands, Mari, in terms of what is required from the script, the music, the casting, set props, costumes, all those sorts of things? Anything, particularly demanding here in comparison to other shows?
I think that with regards to this particular one, I think as long as you lend yourself to being sympathetic with the costumes, you're talking about it being set in various different periods of time and that kind of thing. The Sleeping Beauty is it's a bit similar with lots of other fairy tales. They're set in you're not really able to tell exactly which period they're set in. And so you can have a bit of fun with the costumes and things like that within that. We're talking about the time travel section, for example. We had a time travel section in this because we started in the present day and then went back to when she was born. And we had the Dame coming in a very outrageous sort of young hip hop type costume and thought about the musical connotations of that and had like a little snippet of something that the adults would recognize as being something that happened a big moment in time musically from sort of 16 years ago. So that was quite fun. And I think if you do that, then you're keeping everybody happy with the timeline, but the costumes as well. You can have a bit of fun with it because ultimately, although people think, well, we're in present day, everybody knows that a fairy tale really doesn't have a particular date attached to it. So our fairy was particularly different this year. She was very colourful, had a bright orange wig, so it wasn't this sort of traditional white fairy. And I guess that also helped right at the very beginning of the show set it apart and say, well, this is Sleeping Beauty, but not maybe as you know it.
In terms of the dragon as well, that's presumably can be done in many different ways. It could be puppetry, it could be use of UV, but it's a particular skill and it's something that, is a slightly different demand that, might take a bit of time in the tech and so on.
Well, yes, I mean, we had an enormous inflatable dragon, not to give any spoilers. But I mean, no, quite a lot of people have no idea that it was inflatable, really, because the way it's lit. But obviously, it does require time and tech to make sure that you can get it blown up backstage behind whichever cloth you're bringing in. The tech team are okay with moving the dragon around on the stage. That the prince was used to being able to move around with it, and that all takes time in tech, and of course lighting it, because you want to light it in a way that makes it look effective and amazing and powerful. So yes, it shows its own problems, but you deal with it once you've got it there in situ, and you go, right, okay, let's make this look amazing.
And this is a great example, Rob, of something that surprises the audience because everybody knows the story. They might think they know what's going to happen in front of them, but actually, if you can throw a curveball and a surprise, a spectacular surprise as well, then that lifts the show, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally. And like the time travel that Mairi was just talking about, where do you end up? We did something when I directed it last in Halifax, and we ended up accidentally back in prehistoric era. So you ended up playing around with different periods of time. You don't quite know where you're going to end up. And going back to Mairi and Fraser's production there as well, yeah, we might know the story, but how are you going to tell that story? The idea of the waking back up to go on your own, to be part of your own quest is really, really important. And lots of writers and practitioners are looking at different ways to tell the Sleeping Beauty story, particularly in relation to modern sensibilities. And that's not about sanitizing the story in any way. It's the whole idea that what Michelle Smith talks about, which is in relation to it's new wine in old bottles, and that you can really retell these stories, surprise the audience, while still having those real strong links back to what audiences expect from their production or their story.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of those changes in a moment's time. But Mairi, this is one of those pantomimes that has benefited over time. Remember, it was one of the early ones. It was really, really popular in the 18 and 1900s, but then it got that sort of rebirth through the full-length Disney animation. And again, recently, you mentioned Maleficent as well. All of this sort of coverage and this sort of awareness of the story can only help pantomime, can't it?
Well, absolutely, and you can see that with some of the other titles that Disney has remade in the recent years, and how much it really affects everybody's wishes to see it. The theatres start to request it, that kind of thing. But I do think that Maleficent was one of the ones that I think really helped this one come back to life, because it's that wicked, and seeing it from the opposite side, seeing it from the other person's view, but it still reignites that fire in people and makes them think, oh, I'd like to revisit that. But I also think the ballet is still redone so often, and there's still so many people out there who love to see the ballet. That's where I knew Sleeping Beauty from. That was my background, was the Tchaikovsky ballet, which originated back in 1890. And there's so much love for that piece. The music's so famous. I think that keeps everybody in love with the fairy tale as well. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see if Disney end up redoing Sleeping Beauty at any point.
My colleague Simon Sladen's let me know today that in advance of this podcast that 10% of pantos are the Sleeping Beauty title, and only 11% this year are Snow White, Aladdin, and Beauty and the Beast. They all come in at around about 11%. So yeah, it's really got traction.
We talked about the sensibilities and social changes in the 21st century, Rob, and we've mentioned this before. There are some pantomimes that it's the pantomime that's the problem and have to, make changes, but some of the actual story on which the pantomime is based. And I think Sleeping Beauty is one of those where the story is an issue in itself. And this all began really, I mean, it's been discussed a number of times, but I remember pre-COVID, a mum in England prompted all sorts of coverage around the world because she wanted Sleeping Beauty, the story, removed from the school curriculum for young children because of the inappropriate message it sends about consent. And that's one of the areas here, Robin. And it is an issue. And that true love kiss scenario is something that is changing, isn't it?
Very much so. Going back to this notion of choice, having choice and agency in the in your story, so that again, it's really important that there is choice and agency, and that we have societal respect for those choices and those moments of agency for those characters. So it's absolutely right that writers and directors and other practitioners are really looking at this story. And that's why I think it's important to note that the kiss came a lot later in this story, going back to that one element. The kiss came a lot later. So it's how do you go back to some of the original ideas and themes that are within the story, not necessarily always getting hooked up on some of those later manifestations of the story. So it's great to hear around Fraser and Murray, your production in relation to the consent. Chris Jarvis was exploring that in Sleeping Beauty, making sure that the consent was really explicit. It was also in the program. It was also referenced on stage. Susan McKenna, it's swapped so that it's Sleeping Beauty that resolves to get Prince Charming back from Caraboss, taken away some of those elements of the story. So I think it's really important to go back to some of the very origins of this story, if it's a tale that we still want to tell, rework it for sensibilities for the modern age, for modern society, modelling the world as it could and should be, not as it has been. And that is absolutely central for the survival of the story.
Yeah, I mean, there is an interesting debate to be had, and it has been had, and people would excuse it in the past by saying it's akin to the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and so on. But I think it can be misinterpreted in so many ways, and that sort of inappropriate message has to be taken out so that it's not misconstrued. It's the same, I guess, in many ways with Snow White as well, of course. But I mean, there are lots of other things involved in this, Mairi, as well, because people have been critical of perceived sexism, particularly passive princesses, and that sort of reinforcement of marriage as any girl's ultimate goal. There are lots of other things here that you need to address as well, aren't there, Mairi?
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, Sleeping Beauty tales been criticised by, modern day feminists, as you've said, and but you can understand it if you look into the very early stories, particularly Basil's son, Moon and Talia, you can see why it's criticised, because that goes much darker. But then so do a lot of these fairy tales and these folk tales, and then we take the light from them. And unfortunately, in this instance, the light was taken from them, but we added the kiss in. Then obviously that now in modern day is still, well, that's not really acceptable unless you get consent, of course. So you do have to be very careful with it. But you can draw parallels with all of these sorts of things. I mean, for example, in Frozen, you've got, I mean, in the case, it's the shard of ice, but it's got a similar effect. And it's true love that's required to break the spell. And it's the true love of Elsa with Anna. So there's still, in lots of stories, there's this same theme and aspect that's taken from these old traditional folk tales where love conquers all. And I think as long as that's the reason that you're going forward, that love conquers evil, then anything can be done with these folk stories to keep them alive and to keep them up to date.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Rob, that I think it was the Oxford Playhouse in their Sleeping Beauty. They didn't have a prince at all. And Princess Aurora slept for 1,000 years, and she simply woke up unkissed, no kiss involved at all, as part of a time traveling narrative, which you mentioned already. And this gave them opportunities to discuss and explore different plot points. And they didn't have to deal with that challenge of consent head on. And so all these things that are being criticized are an opportunity to be more imaginative, aren't they?
They are. And I think it was the Oxford Playhouse production, which again looked at the empowerment of that central character. She's a fashion designer, I think, that in the Toby Hulse production didn't want to take on the kingdom and to carry on that lineage, wanted to forge her own way in the world. So that's really key. And that's why I was mentioning earlier around going back to the original stories. I love this idea of pulling out the lightness, because actually it's just a waking up in some of those stories. It's not around a kiss, it's a waking up. So again, it gives opportunities, possibilities moving forward.
Is it one of your favourites, Mairi, in comparison to, many of the other pantos that you've been involved with?
Oh, I do really love it. I think my favourite's got to be Beauty and the Beast, but Sleeping Beauty is definitely up there. I think that there's lots of magic within it, and you can really play around with the fairy niceties within it, and then the real opposition of the baddie, and getting the darkness within that as well, to have the children really on the edge of their seats, wanting to find out what's going to happen and booing the baddie and things like that. So you've got a really easy good and bad within Sleeping Beauty, which makes for a very lovely pantomime. So I do thoroughly enjoy it. This is the second time that I've directed. The first one was an Ian Laughlin production, and it was down in England, and it was more the traditional sort of the fairy with her 8 other fairies that all bestowed gifts on Sleeping Beauty, and at the end of that, when she fell asleep, and in that one we had the spiralling tower that turned around, which was quite clever, and then we used time travel in the second act to sort of skip past the amount of time we'd been asleep and get to the point where we had to wake her up. So so it's really nice to have done it in a slightly different way with this Fraser Boyle script, and looked at a new narrative to it.
And you've already spoken about how popular it has been in this last panto season. Does it have a bright future? Is it going to carry on evolving?
I think it does. I think the very fact that everybody is really rethinking this story absolutely proves that, and writers are really excited to approach that story, particularly like the voices of Vicky Stone and Susie McKenna and Toby Hulse, and what Chris Jarvis has been doing down in Poole as well. I think it absolutely shows that this has building on the history a long future ahead.
And what about you, Mairi? Is it one that you will be happy to return to in the future?
Absolutely, and I think that each time you come to it, you take a different angle, you look at it differently, and if it's a script written by a different writer, again, it's going to have their own feelings and thoughts in there too. So and then with a different cast, you get presented with different ideas as well. So it's ever evolving, and it's nice to see it taken so beautifully into the hearts of the audience this year.
Well, it is a fabulous panto. It has all of the panto elements, or many of them at least. It's easy to see why it is so successful and why it survived since that very first panto production back in 1806 at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. Fascinating to chat with you. Rob and Mairi, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin.
Well, that's it for now. Don't forget to subscribe to the series where you normally get your podcasts from, and make sure you join me for the next episode when we're going to be exploring the world of props and scenery. I'll be chatting to the award-winning scenic designer Ian Westbrook next in episode 98.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.